Hi everyone! It's a beautiful winter day here at Tank Archives headquarters. I got my trusty Ushanka out of storage, enjoying the snowbanks and snowballs and snowmen and all the various other snowy festivities. And I thought, well, this is a perfect day to talk to you about mobility of tanks in snow. You've probably read about this, but generally, whenever it's mentioned, it's generalized to, all German tanks had bad mobility in snow, all Soviet tanks had good mobility in snow, and this is usually used as an excuse for German generals to, say that, oh, it's not their fault that they lost the Battle of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad and, every battle that they lost during the winter. Let's not talk about the ones where they lost in the summer. It doesn't count. Anyway, so there is a bit of a kernel of truth to all this, and it is demonstrated best of all by the T-34. Thanks to its wide tracks that you can see here and powerful engine, it did have pretty good mobility in snow. This was established starting all the way in the trials of the A-34, the prototype for the T-34. So these prototypes were finished in very early 1940, and as you can imagine, it snows quite a bit in the USSR in the winter, even in the southern bits. So they were tested in snow. Trials held in February, these were some of the very first outings of these brand new tanks, revealed that the A-34 could drive pretty effortlessly with 1 meter of snow cover, so snowbanks 1 meter deep, which was a pretty impressive feat, but turns out that wasn't the limit. In March of 1940, A-34 prototypes were taken on more thorough trials, and it turns out that they could drive with up to 1.8 meters of snow, so nearly 2 meters of snow. It didn't save, the documents didn't specify if they couldn't drive in deeper, it's just they couldn't find any deeper snow than that. And it wasn't just flat terrain that the A-34 could negotiate, it could also negotiate slopes with up to 1.5 meters of snow cover. Again, these are not man-made obstacles. They had to deal with whatever terrain was available for trials, but A-34 back then could effortlessly handle anything that was thrown at it. There were trials held in March, the long-distance drive from Kharkov to Moscow that you're probably well aware of if you've read my book. These trials were held over very snowy conditions as well. The highway that the tank drove on was covered in up to half a meter of snow, but that was not a problem for the T-34. In 1942, there were some very interesting trials held that actually compared a lot of tanks. So there were 3 man-made packed snow walls up 1.7 meters tall built. And this was a pretty effective obstacle. Even you don't think that snow can really stop a tank, but a 1.7 meter tall snow wall was actually pretty useful. Not against the T-34. The T-34 punched through these obstacles in 10 seconds. So 3 pretty large packed snow walls, 10 seconds, not a problem. Stalin even famously stated that the T-34 flies like a swallow over deep snow. So, as you can see, that thick white tracks and a powerful engine are indeed very useful things when you want good mobility in winter. Now, the KV-1 tank had more or less the same. You can see white tracks, powerful engine, so same V2 that the T-34 had, but supercharged to 600 horsepower instead of 500. And it did show pretty good mobility in snow in the winter of 1941. However, Stalin was still unsatisfied, so he actually requested that either the engine be supercharged even further to 700 horsepower, or the weight of the KV-1 tank must be reduced. And this was one of the first steps towards the creation of the KV-1S tank, which was significantly lighter than the KV-1. So the KV-1, it was, even though it had also this powerful engine and wide tracks, it was much heavier than the T-34, and it couldn't negotiate snowbanks that were quite as deep. So based on frontline troops, what they were reporting, it could negotiate snowbanks up to 90 centimeters deep, which, it's not as good as the T-34, but still very impressive. Of course, the Red Army was not entirely composed of T-34 and KV tanks. The majority of tanks produced in 1941 were these little guys, T-60 small tanks. These are very commonly called light tanks. They were not light tanks. They were small tanks, which is 1 degree smaller than a light tank. And, well, their engine was not nearly as powerful, but more importantly, the tracks were much, much narrower. And, of course, it was unreasonable to expect the same degree of mobility as from a T-34 or a KV. And so the mobility, officially in manuals, these tanks could navigate snow cover up to 30 centimeters deep. In practice, this was not exactly the case. So if the terrain was uneven, bumpy, the snow cover was uneven, it was about 25 centimeters and they could drive through before bottoming out. It's not a big tank. The tracks aren't very wide. The clearance isn't very good. So not exactly the best suited thing for winter. This was not a surprise to anybody in the Soviet Union, and there were track extensions developed. So if you see Winterketten or American ECCs, same idea, just an extension. These ones were held on with bolts, so they made the tracks wider. They more than doubled the tank's ability to drive over snow, so added an extra 30 centimeters of snowbank depth that it could drive over. Unfortunately, same as with any other track extenders, it was really easy to hit them on a tree stump or a rock or something like that, and they would break off. So they were never accepted for production, even though they boosted the tank's mobility pretty radically. Now, the T-60's replacement, the T-70, here I'll hold them up side by side, the tracks are a little bit wider. They're not super, they're not like the T-34's tracks, but they're a little bit wider. More importantly, the engine was much more powerful, so the T-70 could drive over snowbanks 40 to 50 centimeters deep, which doesn't sound, it's not as much as the KV, it's not as much as the T-34, but it was good enough. So the T-70 light tank was much, much more useful in winter combat than its predecessor. Now let's take a look at some foreign tanks. First, the Panzer I. See, same sort of general idea. Very narrow tracks, not very high clearance. The first Panzer I tested in the USSR in winter conditions was actually captured in the Spanish Civil War, and so it was tested pretty thoroughly, as it was the most modern German tank available for trials. In the winter, it actually didn't do that badly, considering it's very light, small tank, very narrow tracks. It could traverse snowbanks up to 450 millimeters, so 45 centimeters deep. However, that was under the absolute ideal conditions. So on perfectly flat terrain, it could go at maybe 6 kilometers per hour. It couldn't drive for very long. The maximum depth at which it could operate more or less reliably was 30 centimeters, so about the same as a T-60 tank. 30 centimeters might not sound like a lot, but everything is understood in a comparison. The Panzer 35T, or the light tank Model 35, the Czech tank used by Germans, crews reminisced that they could not drive in snow at all. So there's a captured POW interrogation posted on my blog. The Germans captured say that these Czech tanks only drove on roads simply because they could not operate in the snow whatsoever. Now this is interesting because these tanks were trialed in the USSR in the late 1930s, and the off-road mobility turned out to be quite good, much better than the T-26's off-road mobility. And the T-26 was capable of driving in about 30 to 40 centimeters of snow. So this is a very interesting comparison that deserves further study. Unfortunately, I don't have that many documents on the T-26's mobility in snow. All right. Next, we have the Panzer III tank. this was another tank that was, of course, much more representative of the Wehrmacht's tank units than the Panzer I. You can see the tracks are a little bit bigger, the engine's a bit more powerful. Sadly, I don't have detailed numbers on its performance in snow. You can see this is actually Tauk Panzer 3. It's much better at dealing with liquid water than solid, but I do have results of trials against that same set of 3 snow obstacles that the T-34 passed through. Remember, the T-34 could negotiate these walls in 10 seconds. The Panzer 3 took 16 minutes. So, as you can see, it's not, it was very reasonable for German tankers and German commanders to be incredibly impressed by the T-34's ability to negotiate snow obstacles and just driving around the snow in general. But as you can see, the comparison with the, say, T-60, T-70 tanks, they were definitely not immune to being immobilized by snow whatsoever. So it's not exactly correct to say that all Red Army tanks were better at driving through snow than German tanks. All right, now let's take a look at some other foreign tanks, most notably the ones sent to the USSR as a part of military aid. The first of those to arrive was the Matilda, or the infantry training tank Mark II. This is usually shown off as an example of why foreign tanks don't work well in the USSR. There's some famous photos of these tanks sliding every which way in that and icy roads and sliding off. And indeed, they did have some issues. One is that you can see there's the grousers of the track. The traction is improved by having these little divots in the track. Those became packed with snow very quickly, and the tanks would lose traction. You can see the side skirts here as well. These little ports are designed to have mud get squeezed out of them as the tank drives, so it doesn't get immobilized by having mud trapped in between the hull and the side skirts. That did not work as well with snow. So some snow would, of course, fall out, but as the tanks drove, the snow would melt. When you stopped them again, the snow would freeze, and the tracks would become jammed because there's no way that it could turn there's a bunch of ice just behind the side skirts. So big disadvantage there. However, the Matilda could drive in up to 60 centimeters of snow. So twice as much as a T-60 tank, more than even a T-70 tank. Not as good as the T-34 or KV, but it was far from helpless in winter conditions. Now, the Matilda also was used in trials against those same 3 snow obstacles, snow walls up to 1.7 meters tall. Its weak engine, did not perform very well in these trials. It took 21 minutes, so significantly longer than any other tank used in those trials to cross these obstacles. Now, the other famous tank, infantry tank supplied to the USSR through as military aid from the British was the infantry tank Mark III, the Valentine. The Valentine is it really feels like the Matilda's weaker cousin. It has same gun, thinner armor, 2-man turret crew, but it turned out to work significantly better in snow. So it could actually drive through snowbanks up to 700 millimeters deep, 70 centimeters, so deeper snow. It crossed those same 3 snow barriers in just 14 minutes, so not even just better than the Matilda, better than the Panzer III as well. Additionally, it could drive up slopes, so the Panzer III, in those conditions, it was okay at going through level obstacles, but if there was a slope, especially if it was covered in snow and ice, it would be stopped by a 12-degree slope. The Valentine was not. The Valentine could climb much better than the Panzer III could in winter conditions, and also there were spurs developed for it by Red Army troops that even increased its mobility in snow and ice even further. Then we have the Churchill tank. The Churchill tank is an interesting case. So plans to send it to USSR were drawn up as early as November of 1941. So shortly after it entered production in the UK, but since this tank was so new, they didn't know how well it would operate in Soviet conditions. So it was sent to Canada. Two of the tanks were sent to Canada for trials. And the British specifically stated that we need to test these tanks in conditions, the same conditions as you would see in Russia, which to them meant minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius is the same. These tanks were sent to Manitoba, I believe, and they were tested in the winter. Unfortunately, the Churchill was not a reliable tank. So these tanks arrived in closer to the spring of 1942, and they spent most of their time in repairs. So by the time they could really get out there and drive around and actually be used in trials, it was already spring. The coldest temperature the Canadians could record was negative 34 degrees, so not quite was what was required. But it turns out that Churchill drove around fine in the cold weather, but snow and mud were big problems. They would get packed in the big fenders that were in front of the tank, and they would bulge up, and they would prevent the gun from being traversed left and right. And, well, more importantly, after about 8 to 10 kilometers of driving, according to reports from the Eastern Front, they would just fall off because there was so much mud and snow bulging up from underneath. Unfortunately, I do not have complete trials results for you either. Okay, finally we have American tanks. So here is the medium tank M3. This is a Grant rather than a Lee, but the idea still holds. Big tank, fairly heavy, very narrow tracks. This was one of the biggest drawbacks to this design that sadly was inherited by the tank's successors. And however, the engine was still pretty powerful, and so in trials, the medium tank M3 could traverse up to 80 centimeters of snow, so much more than a Valentine or a Matilda, about the same as a KV. Still a far cry from the T-34, but this was considered satisfactory mobility, especially for something with very narrow tracks. Now, the T-41 rubber tracks, as you can see here, the track links were just rubber blocks. So not much traction in snow and ice. The tank could drive on flat terrain. Its powerful engine allowed it so that those same trials against 3 anti-tank obstacles, sadly I don't have the time that it took to traverse them, but it took 6 tries, same as the Valentine, so presumably it had similar results. But when driving up a slope in the winter, this is where the problems came in. The rubber T-41 track just did not have enough traction. You could get spurs, removable grousers. There's a couple of them. Put a couple of them on each track. Mobility in the snow improved, but 2 problems with that. One is that there was a shortage of these grousers, and they would get broken off periodically, just because of the nature of these track attachments. And so performance was improved, but not really that much. And, well, the M3 was never considered a particularly good tank in the Red Army to begin with, and this kind of bad mobility on slopes in the winter was just another nail in the coffin. However, next we get the medium tank M4, specifically the M4A2. So, as you can see here, unfortunately, same narrow tracks. These do have grousers, so these are T-54s, I believe. The USSR mostly got Sherman tanks with T-49s. The T-49s have parallel bar grousers, and those did improve mobility in the snow compared to the smooth T-41s, but they became packed with snow very quickly and lost all traction. Of course, results in the field are different than results in controlled trials. So in controlled trials, the Sherman could drive in a 80 centimeter deep snowbank, same as its predecessor, but on the battlefield, commanders had a much more pessimistic evaluation of its off-road mobility. Its maximum depth at which it could operate was 20 to 30 centimeters, so about the same as the small T-60 tank, after which mobility became very poor. The tank would sink and slip, especially again on inclines. So the most common way of dealing with this problem was to cover slopes in tree branches or logs or sand, and sometimes, unfortunately, had to do this in combat. So I've seen a couple of award orders for tankers who had to climb out of their tank mid-battle and cover a slope in front of their Sherman with sand or twigs, so it could climb up. All of them survived, that at least that I've read about. So might not have been that insane of a strategy, but still highly suboptimal. I'm not going to give away all the details of this. You can read a lot more about the performance of the M4A2 tank on the Eastern Front, especially in winter, in my upcoming book, Sherman Tanks of the Red Army. It is available for pre-order now. Alright, so as you can see, it's not quite a universal truth that all Soviet tanks work well in snow. It's not exactly a universal truth that all foreign tanks were completely immobilized by the snow and were no good when winter came. But, you know, as always, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But the T-34 and the KV, at least, you know, in the winter of 1941, 1942, they were superior to any other tank in the battlefield when it came to overcoming snow obstacles.